Hello, everyone. Welcome to the online book launch for lessons from the Zapatistas, from armed insurgency to the people's autonomy. My name is Samir. I'll be one of the moderators alongside Matt. We're both from the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education based in Toronto. I'm going to give a brief description of the school for those who may be interested and might not know, and then we'll get on to the event. So the Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education was founded in 2023 by members of the Socialist Project, an eco-socialist organization based in Toronto. The school emerged at a moment when popular frustrations abounded over inequality, the narrowing of democracy, the squandering of human potential, and the ever clearer reality of the impending environmental catastrophe. We strive to provide radical, accessible, and practical educational programming for those seeking to better understand and address the crisis of our current times. Tonight's discussion will feature comments from the two authors, followed by an audience Q&A. For the sake of time, we'll be taking written questions and comments only. Just use the Q&A box to be found on the bottom of your screen and send in your questions at any time. We'll then read out the questions and hear further thoughts from the authors. I'm going to do a short land acknowledgement and then turn it over to Errol Sharpe to introduce the book. The Leo Panitch School for Socialist Education works on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Chippewa and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Further, we acknowledge the right of First Nation peoples to true national self-determination. We believe that it's important to recognize the common struggles experienced by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous working people, as well as the ways in which capitalism relies on prejudice, exploitation, and oppression to keep us all divided. One of the authors, Lia, in the English introduction to the book, says as much when she points out that the Zapatistas point out that this inclusion and declining standard of living has now been extended beyond Indigenous people to all of us, all but the 1%, from Alaska and Canada to Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America, and in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. So now I'm going to turn it over to Errol Sharpe from Fernwood Press to introduce the book a little more, and as well as the authors, so we can get on with the event.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Lia and Peter for putting this book together, for the Spanish edition and the translation of the book. I wanted to thank the Latin American Council for Social Science that published the Spanish edition, and of course the Zapatista who put it all together in a wonderful way. And last but not least, the people at Fernwood who did the work to get the book down and promote the book and so on and so forth. I don't have a whole lot to say. I just want to just say a few words about some of the impressions that I have of this book. And two words that came to my mind as I was reading this book in various forms, in its manuscript forms and finally in its printed form and so on, was the two words concepts of anatomy and dependency. And what I think is important about this book, or one of the really important things about this, is that it offers a new approach to how we can organize ourselves and how we can organize society. And I'm just going to quote a couple of little things here. On page 2, you say the Zapatista posit that if the state isn't going to solve our problems, then we must solve them ourselves. They have drawn on pre-colonial indigenous forms of collective democratic and self-government in which every participant in solving our problems ourselves. So this is one of the, I think, basic fundamental foundations of the book. Then just down a couple of paragraphs, the idea of autonomy is of course controversial and polemical. We ourselves come from a background where we feel, from a leftist perspective, that the government or the state is where we should look to solve our problems and those of others, including those of the environment and the planet. Many still believe that. That is not happening, and that is why we may simultaneously feel devoid of hope for the future, yet constantly seeking new alternatives. I met with a friend last night, and part of our discussion during that time was despair over what's going on in the world and about it. And part of that, as suggested in what I quoted, part of that despair comes from the fact that we keep thinking that the government's the one that's going to save us, and that it's not happening, as was suggested. But so we get disparaged because we don't see any other alternative. What I think is important about this book, it does offer an alternative. And as I said in the book in a few places, that alternative is still being worked out. That is still in progress. But one of the things that really amazed me about the book was the end part is only in the English edition, where you talk about the reorganization of the Zapatista. I don't know, but I don't know of any organization, certainly not in the North, that talks about alternatives from time to time that actually practice them. It's good enough to talk about theory, alternatives in theory, but if we don't practice them, all we're doing is talking about them. The other thing about the book that I think is often absent in much of the left literature that is published in the North, at least, is how you deal with the question of culture, and how culture is a fundamental part of how people think, how people behave, how they see the world, how they understand what's going on. And the culture that we live in is designed for one purpose, and that purpose is for the accumulation of wealth by the capitalists and the capitalist leaders. The other concept that I really was taken by is the command by obeying. The idea that leaders take their direction and take their make their decisions based on what the people are telling them needs to be done. In other words, the people themselves are the final authority. The authors do talk also about the question of land. For indigenous, peasants, and rural people, land and territory are more than just sources of work and food. They are also culture, community, history, ancestors, dreams, future, life, and mother. So when we're talking about land and we're talking about this, we're not just talking about the ground that we walk on. We're talking about a broad range of understanding that we need to work on. And I wanted to just quote one other thing. States have different kinds of government at different times, according to this analysis. But whether it is a progressive democracy that contains dissent through class conciliation, or an autocratic dictatorship that represses dissent, will depend on what capitalist needs at any given moment. Whatever the capitalist state does, and the government that administers and runs it, whatever it does, it's doing it in the interest of capital. That doesn't mean that it's dictated by capital, because the state plays a very, very important role in alleviating contradictions. It stands between the people and the corporations, and keeps us apart, so that the people are always being manipulated and controlled, so that they can't they can't form any kind of a meaningful resistance. Many times these things are not pointed out by people on the left in the North, and we still think that somehow or other we can get what we need out of the state. Well, if we push hard enough, the state from time to time will give us something just to shut us up. However, it's only there, they only give it to us because they want to avoid conflict, because the capitalist system cannot handle conflict unless it's one that's imposed by itself, of course, because instability doesn't work for them. So those are some of the things that I just thought I'd mention that struck me as being important. And there was another statement here that you made. Are you satisfied with removing the bad foreman and replacing them with a good foreman? Well, that is largely the approach that is taken by much of the progressive body in the North. If we have a bad politician, we replace him with a good politician. So, we had Polyev and now we got Carney. Which is good? Which is bad? Is either one of them doing anything different? No. They may be manipulating things a little different and making statements that are going to appeal to the people, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to finally say one of the things that impressed me with the book was the fact that you drew on so many sources to build your theory and the direction that you wanted to go. This wasn't a dogmatic ideology that is driven by some dogmatic position or statement or view that has to be defended all the time, come hell or high water. So those are a few of the comments that I wanted to make and a few of the observations that I made. And I'm sure that Lia and Peter will expound on some of that stuff far more than I can. So thank you very much again for inviting me to say a few words, and thank everybody for putting this book together. I think this book and books like it, ideas like it, we have to see that we need to change the world, not just put on a new roof or put on a new window or put on a new floor. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can turn it over to the two authors to talk about the book a little.
Okay, thank you very much. First, thank you to Errol for the great introduction and for your observations on the book, and also to you and the rest of the staff at Fernwood for doing a marvelous job in editing the book and designing the book and promoting the book. And thank you to Samir and Matt and the Leo Panitch School for offering up this opportunity to present this new book. We're very happy to be here. So this is the book. In case people haven't seen the physical book, it looks like it's coming out in a reverse mirror image on the screen. But it's, as already been said, Lessons from the Zapatista, from Armed Insurgency to People's Autonomy. I think I'm first of all, also very happy to see a few people that we know who are connected, like Carlos and Rosemary from the farm worker movement in Texas and the Texas-Mexico border, who I know have followed the Zapatista movement very closely. And I know that Carlos has even met Subcomandante Marcos on various occasions. So it's great to have you guys connected to this presentation. I think I'll just say a few words about the Zapatista movement history, because maybe not everybody who's connected knows about it. So the Zapatistas are a movement almost entirely, but not maybe 100%, composed of indigenous peasants from different Mayan ethnic groups in the southernmost state of Mexico, which is Chiapas, on the border with Guatemala. They have suffered systematically since the European invasion of Mexico and Latin America more than 500 years ago. They've suffered loss of land. They've suffered the suppression of their culture, of their basic human rights, of their languages, and essentially they got to the point where they rose up in 1994 with the slogan "Ya basta," or "Enough is enough." that it was better to die trying to change the world than to die from curable diseases, because it's one of the areas in Mexico with the highest rate of mortality due to curable diseases. So they are an ethnic movement, but in a world where we see a lot of we could call ethnic strife, they are not a movement that speaks for its own ethnicity, but they're a movement that tries to show ways to a different world that would be better for everybody, except for the 1%, but for everybody regardless of their ethnicity. And that in that sense, I think right from the beginning they've been very refreshing. At the time of the Zapatista uprising in January 1st, 1994, it was a world that was torn apart by ethnic conflict. And so that was a very important breath of fresh air. It was also a world that at that time was marked by the so-called end of history. Socialist bloc had collapsed in Europe, and it felt like there was no alternative to neoliberal capitalism. It felt like there were going to be no more armed struggles or guerrilla movements or revolutions. And in that sense, the Zapatista uprising was very important in terms of restoring hope to the left around the world and to people unhappy with the way the world was going and is going still today. So that was 30 years ago. When they had the uprising, there was a war that only lasted a few days. The Mexican army did aerial bombardment in Chiapas. There was combat in different parts of the state. But the scenes on CNN, which at that time was the dominant news source in the world, I'm not sure if that's still the case with social networks, but it was certainly the case then. The scenes of the Mexican army fighting indigenous people caused the value of Mexican government bonds to collapse on international bond markets. And this led the Mexican government to call for a ceasefire and enter into a process of negotiations with the Zapatistas in order to control the bad media image for Mexico. And so some initial agreements, called the San Andres Accords, were reached about indigenous rights, and the government promised to propose an amendment to the Constitution to guarantee indigenous peoples' rights to autonomy and control of territory and culture and language. But then the executive branch, the federal branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch of the government all betrayed that agreement. And that led the Zapatistas to break off all communication, dialogue, and negotiation with the state, with the government, and to develop their own other world, a different world in their own territory based on autonomy. And so that offers another breath of fresh air, because as Errol quoted from the introduction to the English edition of the book, we're in a situation where humanity is facing a tremendous multidimensional crisis, and where in the past we might have expected the state or the government to come and solve those problems, it seems like it's not coming to solve those problems. And it seems like it doesn't matter which part of the political spectrum the current political party in power in any country is, but it seems like no matter what, they're not really resolving the day-to-day problems nor the problems of planet Earth in a real way. And as the Zapatistas say, that's because the state itself, the Western state, the capitalist state form that was imposed on countries throughout Latin America and the global South, is a form that is designed to advance capitalist interests and to facilitate the exploitation of most people by a small minority. Of course, Marx and Engels said that a long time ago, that the state is the executive committee of the ruling class. And so in that sense, we find it very important in the book to lay out what does this alternative other world look like that the Zapatistas are creating in miniature in their territory. So what are the dimensions of their autonomy? But also, what is their political theory and what is their theory of the state? Because It's easy for northern country intellectuals to dismiss a peasant movement of indigenous peasants in a global south country in terms of intellectual arrogance of people in the north. But in fact, we argue that people's social movements like the Zapatistas in the south have been the major source of new critical theory around the world for at least 2 decades. And so we devote a substantial part of the book to talking about Zapatista political theory. So those are 2 of the major elements in the book, although we do start with a historical summary of the movement and particular emphasis on the role of women in driving the original uprising and in creating a landmark revolutionary law of women. But then we pass into what does their autonomy look like. It doesn't look like an ethnic autonomy, even though they're they're indigenous people, and that's very important because it speaks to everybody whose needs are not being addressed by the state anywhere in the world. That speaks to the fact that we can live together in diversity. We can solve our own problems ourselves. We can govern ourselves. And in that sense, we look into how the Zapatistas self-govern. We look into their alternative educational system. We look into their alternative economy that they've built and other aspects of autonomy. And we think that it's not a recipe that Zapatista autonomy could be applied to anywhere else in the world in the same way that it's done by indigenous people in southern Mexico. But we believe that it can give us inspiration and ideas as we debate the role of the state versus social movements and organized society in other parts of the world. And then, as I said, we go into Zapatista political theory. And to address specifically what Errol mentioned, one of the aspects of their political theory that we explain is how they say that the world is like one big capitalist hacienda or factory, I guess I could say, in which each country is a different farm within the global hacienda or a different factory of the same global corporation, and where the presidents of these countries are like the foremen, the shop foremen who are managing the shop floor business, but the owner is the same. That doesn't matter which country it is that the president is the foreman for. And so they point out, as Errol said, that it doesn't matter whether the foreman is apparently democratic or apparently authoritarian. In both cases, the owner is the same, and the profits that are extracted from that country flow in the same direction. The only difference is whether the foreman apparently treats people well or apparently treats people badly. But it doesn't change the distribution of profit flowing to the global capitalist class. And so therefore they ask, are you happy just changing the foreman? Are you happy with your choice if you're in the United States between Biden and Trump, or do you hope for something outside of that narrow possibility that the state presents us with? And so Zapatistas have often talked about false contradictions, and this is really not dealt with in the book, but it's another thing that they talk about, which is the cat dog as a hybrid animal, and in which they say it's neither a cat nor a dog. It's something entirely different, bow meow. And that would mean it's neither Trump nor Biden nor Obama, but something radically different from all of them. And so what they say is that we're always presented with false dichotomies, and if we accept the false dichotomy, then nothing's ever really going to change. And only by breaking out of the false dichotomy that the Western capitalist state presents us with, can we really find a way out of this multidimensional environmental, social, human, economic, health crisis that the world is in today. So I think with that, I'll stop. And I know Lia has to leave early, but I'll give her a chance to make some comments. And then we would love to see your questions and comments that you write in the chat to everybody else who's connected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for introduce the presentation of our book. I start thank you very much for the whole team who organized the opportunity for presentation our book. I am very happy because the book is beautiful. We can see the edition is really, really beautiful. And so thank you very much. I think that when we write the book, our intention is to present the lessons learned from the Zapatistas struggle. And for us, the struggle of the Zapatistas is not only a historical and horizontal struggle for popular people, but also is a way to build a concrete process in the present. How we can think and construct the autonomy day by day. For us, the Zapatistas teach us that autonomy is also a class struggle. This is very important for us because a long time in the discussion, theoretical discussion in the political process of the Marxism and the other forms of struggle, the indigenous peoples is not considered a subject, a political subject. So it's very important to think the indigenous people is a political subject and think and construct day by day a theory and a praxis of the autonomy, of the emancipatory process in our contemporary history. The Zapatistas also teach us how to analyze the agrarian, territorial, and power relation issues from the perspective of indigenous people and in the context of the class struggle. For us, in their perspectives, the concept and the praxis of the autonomy include the analysis about the history of the colonialism, the capitalism, and the imperialism, and the dialectical relation with the consequences of this process in the present. The Zapatistas write a theory of the state and show us the contradiction of the democracy without the emancipation. This is a classical discussion in the Marxism, how win the really emancipation. And the Zapatists today discuss about this problem, and this problem is a historical problem in the debate of the class struggle, and the Zapatists actualize the discussion today. In the other hand, the Zapatistas present us that the autonomy could be radical or relative, according to the historical context. Peter presents us some aspects of the autonomy in the Zapatistas, and we can see the same in other experience in Latin America with the social movements, indigenous movements, peasants movements. So for us, the Zapatistas could be a example of we can to construct the autonomy today. I think that our book it's important for us for the discussion with our movements about the contradictions and how can imagine really ways for the really democracy in our context, especially today when we can see a lot of contradiction in the state, a lot of contradiction in the democracy, a lot of contradiction, including in our struggles in the world, only in Latin America, in the world. So it's very important the debate about what is our concept of the democracy, of the really political participation, of the aspects of the capitalism today, and his contradiction, and learning about the Zapatista is a form to understand and to imagine other ways with the autonomy, and how understand the autonomy in our context. So thank you very much for this space. I don't speak English very well. My language is Portuguese and Spanish. So I think bueno, yo espero que hayan comprendido. Voy a terminar con el español. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on to the Q&A section of the event. We have one so far. Anyone else, if you'd like, please put them in so we can get them to answer. So I'm just going to read out this question, and then maybe the two others can respond to it. As you have mentioned, and the Zapatistas themselves often insist upon, their movement is extremely tied to the cultural and material specificities of the Chiapas, and to spread their ideology is more so to spread their broader sensibilities, not all of the specifics of their structures. The question is, do you have any vision or any general idea of what major centers of capital and territory economic systems like Toronto, New York, etc., could look like with the Zapatista sensibilities? In the Chiapas, it is very tied to autonomy via food sovereignty, sovereignty over their productive inputs and outputs, and other factors that seem almost exactly opposite to those available to individuals in major capital centers. In Toronto or New York City, we see examples of cities now firmly reliant on global capital and service-based economy rather than one of primary resources. All to say, how would or could autonomy look like in such major urban centers? How would they rely entirely on rural zones in some autonomous partnerships?
Okay, that's a very good question, but let me give a couple of initial answers and then also turn it over to Lia. But a few points. Lia mentioned that autonomy can be absolute and relative in the Zapatista view, and this is very important because sometimes it's difficult. It's easy to imagine a peasant community with the ability to feed themselves can have absolute autonomy from the economic system and the political system. But what about movements, whether they're rural or urban, that for one reason or another want to be engaged in the political struggle beyond the local level? Can they also be autonomous, or would autonomy also be a useful strategy for them? And this is something we feel very strongly that regardless of your view towards the state, and that is, for example, the Zapatistas reject the Western state completely and essentially have nothing to do with it, or if your view is we want to, from our neighborhoods, barrios, or rural areas, we want to build strength so that at the national level we can dispute national power. In both cases, we feel local autonomy can strengthen a movement. We think of communities, whether they're urban or rural, as the home base or the home territory or the rear guard of movements. And if a movement wants to dispute national power in a country, but they're weak in their rear guard and their home territories, they're going to be weak at the national level as well. And there's so many ways that the insidious influence of capitalists and political parties and companies at the local level weaken communities and weaken movements in their home base, that creating like a free zone where we self-govern ourselves can be very important for building strength. So I give the example, for example, Mexico City, a number of the neighborhoods or barrios are self-organized on Zapatista principles. And Zapatista principles for self-government are that government should be collective, not based on an individual, and should rotate so that everybody should have the experience as well as the social obligation to participate in self-government themselves at some point. And Zapatistas, so then Zapatistas have 2 or 3 year terms in which people form a group that collectively governs during that time period, and then a new group, and then a new group every few years. And we can also take a hint from when they launched together with the National Indigenous Congress a independent candidate for the presidency of Mexico, where they proposed not a single person to govern the country, but a collective, a government collective, in which the person who would be registered, Marichui was her name, would be just the spokesperson for the larger collective. And so their principles are govern ourselves at a local level and do so in a way that's collective and not individual, and that also rotates so that people can't develop special interests in staying in power. So I can see that as being equally useful for a neighborhood in New York or Toronto. I see that New York just elected Mamdani, so that's an interesting change there. But that's still, we'll see how difficult it's going to be for him to govern. And maybe it would be easier if neighborhoods were organized in self-government councils that then built local strength to engage with the overall city government. That might be the way that the Zapatistas would organize New York City. So those are some of my ideas initially in response to that question. Lia?
I think that the Zapatistas, all activities from Zapatistas, and I think too with other experience similar, the question of the people is how can do to construction the autonomy in the urban context. This is always a question, and I think that the Zapatistas in general speak us that we can see the context of our struggle and imagine the possible ways, and imagine this way with autonomy of the position and a critical vision about the social reality and political reality. Today, for example, we live a problem in our countries with the relationship of the state of the parties, where the condition of to participate is to be with the dependence of the political of the party. There are a lot of social movements who today live a dependence condition, and this is not good, because when we depend of the only of the relation with the party, with the government, with the state, we lost the capacity of think in a critical perspective. So the Zapatistas do a call for this reflection. It's very important for the social movements had independence position with the state, with the politicals, and with the parties. It's the first. And the second is to think about the step by step for the process. For example, we learn with the Cuba, with the ANAP, the methodology peasant to peasant, with the ANAP. ANAP is a peasant movement from Cuba. That the process is not fast. All process needs a time, historical period large. We don't can construction the process the day with the day, but other day. It's necessary think the process in the large time. So the Zapatistas had 13 years with the autonomy, more the other time, the historical time of the struggle of the indigenous people. And the Zapatistas learned from the other historical struggles in Mexico, in Latin America, in the other international context. So this is very important too for the each process, each political process in our struggle. So this is my position about the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have two questions. I'll read them in order and maybe read them both together, and you can answer both. Fernando asks, I wanted to ask if you think that the Zapatista concept of El Pueblo could be crucial for Western understanding of Zapatismo and the autonomy they propose. In other words, do you think the West could understand the Zapatista autonomy founded on the praxis of leading by obeying without understanding the concept of Pueblo? This is because the concept of Pueblo seems to be in opposition to the Western idea of the people. Susan asks, I remember when the news of the Zapatistas arrived, it was also the date of the North America Free Trade Agreement. Was there something about NAFTA that was linked to the Zapatista movement, or is that only a coincidence? Do you see anything to be learned now in relation to the current situation where free trade is being widely challenged, and there is more awareness of the need to strengthen local economies?
Thank you for those questions. I'm thinking about the concept of Pueblo, and I kind of have two responses. On one side, I think there is a Western concept of the people that does somehow relate to the Zapatista proposal, because I remember in marches when I was young in the United States, we used to chant "Power to the People," and I think that the Zapatista call to self-govern and self-organize is a materializing of the call for power to the people, but in a more democratic sense, perhaps than democratic centralism of past historical periods. But on the other hand, I recognize that the concept of El Pueblo is so much more rich and deep in Spanish and Latin America than the concept of people is in the West and in English. And of course, especially when we talk about indigenous people, where to be a people means to have an entire historical memory and relationship with Mother Earth and spirituality and many aspects that are largely lost in Western society. And so I think that's an element where the Zapatistas are continually dialoguing between so-called modern concepts like democracy, but with that historical memory, that collective historical memory. And the last thing I would say is that in the West, the people have become very individualized. So instead of we the people, it's me the people. And I think that's a very difficult thing to be overcome and that Zapatista thought pushes us to break with that individualization. And on the subject of NAFTA, no, it was not a coincidence. The Zapatistas chose the date for their initial uprising for two reasons. One, because New Year's Eve, all of the soldiers would be drunk, and so it would be easier to have an armed uprising. But number two, that particular New Year's Eve was symbolic because it was the entering into force of NAFTA, as you say, and they saw that as like the final blow against the working class and indigenous people and peasants in Latin America, and a sign of how the world was going to be completely reconfigured under neoliberalism in the interest of capital. And so that was the reason why they chose that date, one of the reasons. Now, what about the current period where there's more criticism of free trade or stepping back? And I think, you know, in no way, means, or form do I support or like President Trump in the United States, but I do think that the world was overdue for stepping back from neoliberal globalization and trade liberalization, not through far-right authoritarianism, of course, but I do think that there's there could be more resonance now with Zapatista lessons, and as you say, the larger awareness of the need to strengthen local economies. And as we point out in the book, one of their major points of emphasis is to rebuild the local economy that was destroyed under neoliberalism and globalization and trade liberalization, and to bring back all of those local services offered by local people, whether you're talking about the butcher, the tailor, the dressmaker, the car repair shop, the food shop, all of those things that were lost need to be recovered at the local community level. It's not just political democracy and self-government, but it's also recovering the local economy. Lia?
About the concept of people, pueblo, I think that in Latin America we had a large traditional process with people and popular. It's part of our tradition in the struggles, and it's a form to think and to elaborate the concept of the common, the communitarian position. And this, it's very, very hard in the indigenous people, but it's the same with the peasant movements and other movements in the urban context. And for us, it's very important to put emphasis in this aspect, because sometimes the form of we speak about the struggle, there are a tendency of put emphasis in the vanguardians people. In general, men's, the men's, and forget that all struggle, it's possible because there are a lot of people, and these people, it's the subject political subjects. So in Latin America, this is very, very hot, this debate in the indigenous people and the struggle of the feminism too. And it's a form to recognize the importance of the people in all struggle. So in the case of the Zapatistas, it's the same. It's a movement that learn about other process, political process, revolutionary process, and put in the center the popular, the pueblo, the people, like a political subject.
First, I had a small question by myself, actually. Has there been any comments from Sheinbaum's new government on the Zapatistas, or inversely from the Zapatistas on the recent change. I saw in the introduction to the book that in the postscript of this book, there are some new translated communications from the Zapatistas on the concept of the reorganization of their concept of autonomy. Could you maybe tease those a little more? Just as a
I'm sorry, you said which new government? I missed one word there.
Mexico's new government.
Okay. Yeah, so Mexico has recently changed from Andres Manuel López Obrador to Claudia Sheinbaum as the president of Mexico, but they're both from the same political party, which was elected as a center left or progressive alternative, but in practice, the Zapatistas would say have failed to deliver on that promise of being different. So they would give it as a classic example of going from a bad foreman to a good foreman, but everything essentially staying the same. However, conditions have substantially worsened in rural areas in Mexico. The drug violence and the use of organized crime by capitalism as a way of clearing out territories by people so that mining and tourism development and other things can come in behind it has become ever more common, and all indigenous and peasant and communities are under attack. And so that means that as well as with 30 years of autonomy, they've learned a lot of lessons. And so those two factors, the changing and worsening conditions in rural Mexico, and the lack of change from so-called progressive governments on the one hand, and on the other hand, their accumulated experience, because they say autonomy is a school. There was no manual or handbook. We had to learn along the way how to build autonomy, and we've learned a lot of things about what works and doesn't work. So in the three communiques that we translate at the end of the book, they announce restructuring, and a few of the elements of the restructuring are to become even more democratic at the local level, number one. Number two, to create local territorial self-government processes that can also involve non-Zapatista communities, because all communities are under attack now by this organized crime / capitalist attack on communities and territories. And number three, their development of what Lia was mentioning now, which is the commons or communal territory, as a new old concept in which they suggest that land and territory should not have ownership, that the origin of the problem is in private property. And even when peasants and family farmers want to have an individual title to land, that immediately puts them in conflict with each other. How the state historically has been masterful in giving overlapping titles to different poor people so that they spend 50 years fighting each other instead of fighting against power and capitalism in the state. And that we need to throw out the idea of individual private property, at least when it comes to land and territory, and find ways to communally live on and manage territory. And then they've even pushed the idea of the commons or the commune even further into the way we think and the way we address all kinds of things, whether it's healthcare or other aspects of our life, that the commons or the commune should be our guiding light as in terms of thinking through problems. Over. I think Lia may have disconnected because she had to go teach her class. I don't see her connected now.
Yeah, I think we might have lost her. That's okay. We have two more comments by Benvolio. Peter, I'm wondering if you can see the Q&A question. Benvolio has a kind of paragraph about explaining his question. I'm just going to shorten it just for time's sake for all the attendees.
Okay.
So Benvolio asked, what do you think the future of broad international or at least multi-community projects would look like in a world of more autonomous communities? Processes like pharmaceutical or biomedical research reliant on the work of several experts across various communities operating within one industry seem like they would be more difficult to manage. Would it be multiple communities collaborating with broader bodies, including internationally? And the second question is another kind of, I guess, question about how this might work. What would autonomous self-managed movements look like in places like Toronto or similar parts of North America, where Indigenous people have been made minorities after centuries of genocide? How can we ensure autonomy avoids Indigenous erasure? With Indigenous peoples made much more of a minority in Toronto, how do you avoid a sort of tyranny of the majority, so to speak, and have the Zapatistas done so themselves? So those are the two comments, if you'd like to.
Okay, and I see one more question from Aaron about, is it possible to visit the Zapatistas or how to be in solidarity with them? So I'll take all of those questions together. I think that when we talk about a larger scale of a world of more autonomous communities, we have to look at examples of, I think, of federalism. So we had the interesting example in Rojava with the Kurdish movement, although I'm not sure what's going on there now in the negotiations with Erdogan and Turkey. But as an example of local autonomies built into a federalist relationship, and what's emerging here in Southeast Asia with the ongoing Myanmar revolution, if and when it's finally possible to overthrow the military dictatorship of Myanmar, it looks like there will be a federation of autonomies, will be the new state structure. And so I think we have to look in that kind of a direction. In terms of processes like research, the Zapatistas themselves held a couple of international conferences that they called for, which in Spanish were called conciencias, which is actually like a play on words, because conciencia on one hand means consciousness or conscience, but on the other hand, it could be thought of as two words, conciencia, which would be with science. And so the Zapatistas convoked Mexican and international scientists to two large conferences with their communities to talk about precisely what would a different science look like, and what would a science and that is allied with community level processes and not with capitalist countries look like. And so I think the way they've built a lot of these different national and international dialogues would be a way to think about how to reorganize things like scientific processes. Now, how to avoid Indigenous erasure where Indigenous people are a minority or something like that. Toronto politics I'm completely ignorant about, but I will say that one aspect of Zapatista political organization is what's called the CCRI, or the Revolutionary Indigenous Clandestine Committee, which is their maximum governing authority above both the military wing and the civilian wing of Zapatismo. And in that committee, all of the different ethnic groups are represented by man and woman representatives, including the equivalent to non-Indigenous, which would be mestizo. And so in that sense, they're guaranteeing that every different ethnic group present in the territory will have their voice at the maximum level. I don't know if that's a perfect example or not, but I think there are a lot of different ways to think about how to avoid the tyranny of the majority, as you call it. The Zapatistas are trying to propose, I think, a radical and class-based autonomy. In other words, for the working class, which they would extend to that part of the middle class that actually works for a living instead of living off investments. How we can somehow, based on our diversity, govern ourselves together in a positive way. And I think also, so I think we can think about their example of how they represent different ethnic groups, including non-Indigenous, but we can also think about their principles of collective and rotating government in which everybody has to participate and gets a chance to participate at some point. Are there ways to visit Zapatista regions? Often there are. Their headquarters of their regions are called caracoles, or snails, and under normal conditions, they're open for visitors to come and ask them questions. The individual communities are not necessarily open for security reasons, but those regional government, self-government centers are, except when they're not, also for security reasons. So one usually travels to the city of San Cristobal de las Casas in southern Mexico and tries to visit those areas. And if you're lucky, security permits visiting, and if you're not lucky, it doesn't. And are there tangible ways with international solidarity? There's lots of solidarity committees with the Zapatistas all over the world, and I'm sure wherever anywhere where one lives, one can find one. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Related to Benvolio's comment, I want to ask, I know a lot about, or not a lot, but I've heard about the kind of education system that the Zapatistas have been putting up in the regions and how successful and kind of amazing they are. But you mentioned in the near the beginning when you're giving the historical context about the high mortality rates in that region from curable diseases. Has that been addressed? And this is in kind of conjunction to Benvolio's comment about the new science and your comment about a new science. So I guess I'm asking, have the Zapatistas, I would just want to hear about some other, I don't know, challenges they've attended to and how that's turned out in the present 30 years.
And in terms of healthcare, they've developed a community healthcare system which mixes both Western allopathic medicine with the recovery of indigenous herbal and other kinds of indigenous medicine. And they train healthcare promoters at the village and community level, and they have like a Casa de Salud, a health house in each community. And then at the more regional level, they have fairly large clinics where they have higher level health promoters who are able to do even dental treatment and make eyeglasses and do minor surgeries. And then they have a Zapatista hospital. Now, the Zapatistas don't have any doctors yet as they build their educational system, but they've developed a national solidarity network of doctors in Mexico who voluntarily rotate through the Zapatista hospital and also do training for the Zapatista healthcare promoters, and also dentists who train the Zapatista dental care promoters. And in terms of education, this is a major part in our book, but they've developed their whole educational system, as have other social movements in rural areas in Latin America, because for indigenous people and for peasants, going to a government school is what some people call the first step towards leaving your community and never coming back, because everything you learn is to be ashamed of being indigenous, to being ashamed of being a peasant, that everything is backward in the countryside and everything is modern in the city, and you should move to the city and become a factory worker or an informal economy worker. And the formal education system drives the rural exodus and the departure of young people from rural areas. And so the Zapatistas, as well as other social movements in Latin America, have felt the need to make their own schools that teach a different education that starts by revaluing the community, revaluing peasant agriculture, revaluing local culture, making people feel proud to be peasants, to be indigenous people, and teaching them life skills that will be useful at the community level and don't necessarily obligate them to move to the city. And so they have a whole alternative education system that we address in the book that's really interesting and very inspirational. Over.
Peter, we have one question.
I see a question. Is there a Mayan language current and fluent use? Yes, there are at least, I believe, at least 10 Mayan languages in current fluent use, and all of them have a certain percentage of people who are monolingual. In other words, only speak that Mayan language, whether it's Tzotzil or Tzeltal or Mam or Toholabal or other local languages. And Zapatista education in terms of primary school will be taught in the local indigenous language, but then they'll start to introduce Spanish. And as kids move up, or even adults, because it includes adult education, move up the levels, then they increasingly learn Spanish in addition to their local language. And they feel like Spanish is very important for two reasons. One, as a way to communicate among the different language groups within the Zapatista movement to communicate with each other while they revalue their own languages, but they have to communicate with each other, and that it's also important to understand the language of the enemy, being the state, and so for those two reasons, their education is at least bilingual, so that people become stronger, more strongly grounded in their own local language, but then also become proficient in Spanish.
One more question from Benvolio. Sort of a tangential question, but with our media as it is, so focused on celebrity and icons of politics, Zoran Mamdani is a great example of someone who was able to successfully build fame and thereby momentum for the left. What do you think about leadership? What do you think leadership looks like towards this type of autonomy? Some Comandante Marcos, with his Balaclava and as many aliases as himself, insisted on de-emphasizing the individual as an icon, though he has become some sort of one throughout his struggles. Do you think it is possible or practical for movements in the Western Anglosphere to build with the type of autonomy, anti-idolatry he advocates for, or has social media and mass media made people too broadly reliant on single icons to put themselves behind to some degree?
Well, I mean, even in the Zapatistas, Marcos has often been the subject of criticism, sometimes criticized as egocentric individual or something like that. But as you say, he himself has talked on various occasions about the need to back off from that kind of construction of an icon. And I think there's a dialectic in the Zapatista history where they created the icon of Subcomandante Marcos as a way to attract media and public opinion attention, because it does seem like society is conditioned to respond to the star person, but then use that once the attention is drawn in, then to redirect that attention towards the collective and community level structures that are being built. So, in an ideal world, a figure like Mamdani would draw the attention and the votes, and then create the conditions to redirect things towards a more local, community level kind of self-government structure. We'll see what happens. I'm not living in New York, so I don't have a good feel for the pulse of the city or how that's going to play out. But I think that of course, we have to struggle against the Western Anglosphere individualization of everything. That's a constant struggle in all spheres of life. But I think that we can find the Zapatista example inspirational for that. Over.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, speaking of kind of the communications of the Zapatistas to the broadly world outside, I was kind of impressed by the Radio Zapatista blog. It seems very dense and filled with a lot of material, although much of it is, I can't read it, but it seems like a kind of early internet, like kind of use of the internet to kind of respond to the lack of media attention after the 90s, after it waned. And since, like you mentioned, Mexico was trying to ward off the bad press for it. So this seems like a kind of apparatus that they have that is quite successful. I know a few people who have accessed and learned about it through exclusively the blog.
Yeah, I think that especially the Enlace Zapatista website, where they post all of their writings and communiques in several different languages, is an extremely valuable resource for learning about their political philosophy. And going back to the original uprising, I would say they were the first social movement to build up through the use of the internet, even before the World Wide Web existed. Through email chat groups, they got the news out through the media blockade that the Mexican government created at the time of the original war. And so I think they've been a social movement that both locally and nationally, but also globally, has always been on the cutting edge of alternative media as a way to get the word out despite the monopoly of dominant corporate media. Unfortunately, the Mexican government has put a media blackout on them, as we talk about in the introduction to the English edition, so that people who are not tuned into alternative media may think that they don't exist anymore or may have never even heard of the Zapatistas, unfortunately. But those who are tuned into alternative media will usually find in many different languages a lot of very good coverage of the evolution of the Zapatista movement. And they've always had a strong presence and appeal to those alternative media sources.
Two small questions, and I think we're going to wrap it up after that. Anne asks, some years ago, I know people went from Canada and stayed for some time living in the Zapatista community. Does that still go on? And Benvolio asks, given how many similarities, common sympathies they share, do you know if there has been any degree of dedicated communications and collaborative works between the Zapatistas and the various democratic confederist Kurdish groups in the Rojava, northern Syria, southern Turkey region?
Okay, let me answer those last two questions. When the people from Canada went and stayed for a while in a Zapatista community, that was the time of what's called the Escuela Campesina, the Escuela Zapatista, which was the Zapatista school, where they had two rounds where they invited thousands of people from Mexico and the world to each spend a week living with a Zapatista family. That was only at that one point in time. That was a one-off event that was very important. What you can still do is download from the internet their textbooks that they created for that school, but they're not currently offering that opportunity. And yes, at many the international events that the Zapatistas have organized in Chiapas, they've had Kurdish speakers come and talk to them about autonomy and federalism within the Kurdish movement. And there's also a Kurdish woman who's Azize, who just did her PhD in Mexico at a university program that studies a lot about the Zapatistas and wrote a book in Spanish from her PhD dissertation, which talks about Kurdish federalism and autonomy and Kurdish women's movement within that, and puts that in dialogue with Zapatismo. So I think that's an ongoing dialogue, and as I say, some of us are a little bit confused with the latest things going on with the Kurdish movement, but it'll certainly be interesting to see how that dialogue continues in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Fernwood. So yeah, I think we're going to wrap up now. We've answered most of the questions. We've had over 30 attendees tonight to answer Anne's quick question. Keep an eye out on our website, leopanitchschool.ca, and your emails to hear about new programs as soon as they're announced. And of course, visit the link Matt has put in the chat for the book link with the discount code ZAPA20. Thank you to everyone at Fernwood. Errol, did you want to make a last comment?
I just wanted to thank everybody for participating. It's been a great chat. And I think I hope that the discussion that we've had today will prompt further discussion here about what some of these alternatives are and how we can put some of them into effect. And the building of community is something that we can do, at least in part, wherever we happen to be, if we have the will to do it. And it may start small. You remember that the Zapatista movement's been around for 30 years. They weren't where they are today 30 years ago. And these things have to start small, and we can't get discouraged by small successes or even losses, because we have to go forward. And I think this book, I love the title because it says lessons from the Zapatistas. These are the lessons that we have to learn. And I think we can learn some of these lessons and actually apply them in our own countries, in our own towns, in our own villages, in our own cities, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you very much, Peter and Leah, who's not here anymore, but I think it's a great job. I think it's a great book, and I think it'll make a great contribution to progressive movements in the future.
Thank you, Errol, and thank you to the whole gang at Fernwood, and thank you to Samir and Matt and the gang at the Leo Panitch School, and thank you to the audience for listening to us, and please go out and buy the book and recommend it to your friends. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the attendees and the panelists, of course.